What's up, everybody? Welcome back. We're here with some more MMA DFS picks for DraftKings and FanDuel. Lineup advice, strategies, best bets, card breakdowns, you name it. UFC Vegas 65, Serghei Spivac. Derrick Lewis, welcome. I'm Brian Jester, co-founder at Occupy Fantasy, joined by Jake the Snake, owner of MMADFS.com. Jake, long week, but we do have next week off. That's a little salvation for you.
Yep, man. Get to sleep next week. No need to sleep this week.
Got that right. So we have 12 fights on the card. What we normally do in these videos, we break down the main event, what it means for betting and DFS. We talk about any newcomers on the card. We do have one fighter making their UFC debut on Saturday night. We play good fighter, bad fighter for those fighters who have four fights or less left in the UFC. To give some context to their UFC stats, and that's literally like 75% of the card, so you want to stick around for that. We'll give you a fight that you want to target in DFS where whoever wins should score really well. Prize picks, you see the promo code up there. We'll give you our top prize picks play for Saturday's card. And then we'll close out with a couple of our favorite bets in our stream parlay of the week. So, Jake, let's jump into it. Spivak, Derrick Lewis. You did a great write-up on your site about the fight. Talked about some of the strategy in the Daily Plug at OccupyFantasy.com that went live on Friday evening. So, give me the rundown. I think a lot of people probably know what to expect from Derrick Lewis fights at this point, but maybe people who don't watch every fight aren't as familiar with Spivak. So give me the rundown on this fight and what it means for DFS contest.
Yeah, this is kind of your classic wrestler versus striker matchup. We got Spivak. He's 27 years old. Pretty good wrestler. He's 5-0 in UFC fights when he's landed a takedown. He's just 1-3 when he hasn't. Super reliant on landing takedowns. We've seen him kind of struggle a little bit on the feet, against Tom Aspinall. I mean, who doesn't when he doesn't land a takedown? But that fight was also on short notice, so I don't blame him too much. But this is a tougher matchup. We've seen Spivak beat up on a lot of lower level competition. We haven't seen him really notch too many signature wins. So I think this will be interesting. I mean, then again, we got Derrick Lewis. He's coming in off 2 losses. He's lost 3 of his last 4. 37 years old. He hasn't been doing great lately, but he's been struggling to fight in Texas, man, in his home state lately. He's actually been doing better in the Apex, so we'll see if this goes a little bit better for him in the smaller cage. He's had a little bit better of a track record, but I mean the deal with Lewis, I think most people know what his deal is. Super low volume. He averages 2.57 significant strikes landed per minute. Doesn't really offer much in terms of grappling, so it's just hard for him to score well in DFS when he doesn't land a first round finish. And 15 of his last 17 fights have made it to the second round. So we've oftentimes, I think this is a good comp for this matchup is going to be the Blades Lewis fight back in 2021 where we saw a slower start and then Blades shot him for a takedown in round 2. Lewis knocked him out. Lewis only scored 83 points. He was the cheapest fighter on the slate. He got a round 2 knockout. He didn't end up in the winning tournament lineups. So
I remember
I think that's a
very
pretty
clearly.
fair comp.
It was a great card.
Yeah, that one worked out well for you. I feel like every time we bring up a card, it's like, oh yeah, you won like 100 or 200 grand on that card.
It just feels like the past couple fights or past couple cards we've had fighters that have been on those cards. So just give it. It'll be a stretch over the next few weeks where I've never won with any of those fighters on the card. So don't worry.
There you go. But I think that's a pretty clear path to how Lewis fails. If he doesn't get a first round knockout, I mean, it's not to say he can't end up in winning lineups, but it's just less likely just because he's so low volume and doesn't offer much else. I mean, it's kind of funny during interviews this week, Derrick Lewis was talking about, I was like, oh yeah, I'm fighting a wrestler. I wrestle a little bit. I don't show it very much. So, I mean, Derrick Lewis is a funny guy. We'll see if he's telling the truth. I mean, he has actually done fairly decently against wrestlers to his credit. You look at, he beat Curtis Blades. He beat Alexei Oleinik. He beat Alir Latafi. He beat Blagoy Ivanov. Like, he's actually done pretty decent. The only wrestler to beat him was Daniel Cormier. So,
Decent.
I mean, maybe, and he beat Marcin Tybura. So, I mean, maybe he is telling the truth. We'll see. I don't know. He desperately needs a win. I mean, he can't lose 3 in a row and 4 or 5. So, if he's going to get things back on track before he hangs it up, this is the time to do it. But it's definitely a tough matchup. And if he ends up on his back, he's going to be taking elbows to the face. So, it could be a problem. But from a DFS perspective, just to get back to that, so from high risk, you don't really need one. I'm treating this kind of like a 3-round fight, Like if we see like a typical 3-round heavyweight fight, oftentimes those are kind of round 1 or bust. If we don't get an early finish, there's a higher chance that it busts. But with Spivak, he could still take Lewis down in round 2 and land 100 ground strikes and still score well. But from Lewis's perspective, it's going to be harder beyond the first round. And if Spivac gets more of a hyper efficient finish in the second round, he could still get left out at his price. And in low risk, I don't really think you need to stack just because so often in Lewis's fights, the combined scoring is so much lower. If we get nothing in the first round and then an 80-point winner in the second round, I mean, it makes it really hard to stack the fight. So it's not impossible that you can still play cash and stack it, but it's definitely not a good cash week. So I think I'm kind of limiting my personal stuff to high risk only, and I'm not really playing cash this week. On top of the fact that we have the new rule change, trying to figure that out on top of Lewis, it just seems like not a great cash week
I
in
agree.
general. But
I agree. And for those of you who weren't aware of the change, late swap is now allowed for MMA DFS. We went into the whole strategy and idea behind it in a Tuesday stream. I'll put that link here at the top in the YouTube card as you're watching this. You see here the on DraftKings the note that fight times are static. Again, we'll see how this all plays out. It's the first time for everyone. But again, I encourage you to check out that video if you want more information on what our thoughts are on the MMA late swap addition to DraftKings. All right, Jake, let's talk about newcomers. Just one on the card making their UFC debut. It is Teresa Bleda, which is just an amazing name. I mean, it could be a rapper for all I know. You say Teresa Bleda, I don't know what that is. But making her debut, really young fighter against our girl Natalia Silva. What did you see on tape from Bleda? What kind of fighter is she? What can we expect in her debut?
Yeah, so she's still pretty green. She's from Czech Republic, 20 years old, just 6-0. A wrestler, but I would say pretty poor striking right now. And she's so young. I mean, so often we see these guys struggle that come in when they're that young. So I don't know. We'll see what she has, but I mean, yeah, primarily just a wrestler, and I think we'll be more interested down the road. But definitely some DraftKings scoring potential based on her fighting style. But I think this is a tough matchup for, against a much more well-rounded fighter in Silva. So, we'll see how she looks. But she's coming off a decision win on the Contender Series where she kind of just controlled her opponent the whole time. She's super big, so that's kind of her thing. Overpower opponents, take them to the mat, and control them, and sometimes look for finishes, and other times just kind of lay on them and ride out a decision.
Sounds good. And Czech Republic, that is not the Alaska of Europe, right? For UFC, yeah, we determined that.
Yeah, no, it's not the Alaska. That's I think you're thinking of Germany.
Yeah, Germany. Okay, so close enough, but not quite the Alaska fade that we're looking for in Western Europe. So, all right, let's talk about good fighter, bad fighter, good matchup, bad matchup. Basically, I will name a fighter who has less than 4 fights in the UFC. Was tongue-tied when I tried to explain that earlier. I will say their name. Jake will tell me if they are actually a good fighter or actually a bad fighter, and if this particular matchup on Saturday night is good or bad for their DFS scoring potential. Jake will start at the very top, the highest owned by a decent margin on the card, Jack Della Maddalena.
Yeah, good fighter, good matchup.
Fair enough. This is why he's the highest owned fighter on the card. Okay, making his second fight in just a couple of weeks, fought on October 29th, Cortez Acosta.
Yeah, bad fighter, good matchup.
Okay, fair enough. Moving on down, we have who we just talked about, her opponent, Natalia Silva, in her second UFC fight.
She's a good fighter. I think it could be a good matchup. I mean, she's like really good at landing arm bars. She's going against the wrestler. I think it's a little bit tricky because like obviously you don't want to get controlled for entire fights, so it has the potential to be a bad matchup from that perspective. But she loves going for arm bars. If Bleda is going to be taking her down, there should be plenty of opportunities. So I don't know. I think the matchup is sort of neutral. It's kind of a boom or bust matchup, and she's a good fighter.
Cool. Okay. Moving on down, we have Charles Johnson. Very tough matchup in his UFC debut. A little bit easier matchup this time around.
Yeah, he's a good fighter. I still think it's kind of a tough matchup for him to score well, just against a grinder, like Zimagulov.
Okay, fair enough. And then we got some Ultimate Fighter contenders here. Ricky Tercios, his third fight.
Yeah, I don't think he's a good fighter just because we've seen him be so inconsistent. I mean, he had like 11% striking accuracy in his last fight. It was just insane.
But I was going to say,
pretty good matchup.
Under no circumstances after watching that last fight could you call this guy a good fighter. That was the most frustrating performance I've seen.
Dude, that was really painful. But I think that was also partially due to his opponent in that matchup. He was trying to strike. and he was going against the counter striker who was just loading up on his like right hand the whole time. And Ricky looked terrible in that fight. So I think people are going to be off of him now, which makes it more interesting. But no, I don't think we can call him a good fighter yet after that. And then it's kind of a wild card matchup. Kevin Natividad is coming off a super long layoff, just had elbow surgery. He switched camps to fight ready. Just like so many unknowns in this fight. And then Ricky Tercio's coming off just like one of the worst fights we've seen in a while. So yeah, it's sort of a wild card matchup where we could see a terrible fight, we could see a good fight. I think we're gonna say bad fighter, high upside matchup.
Is it the same for Natividad on the other side? Bad fighter, potentially good matchup, or how do you feel about that?
I think I think so from a volume perspective. I think that Ricky's not much of a threat to get a finish, and he's going to be pushing the pace so hard that we could see Natividad land more volume than he's used to. So it's like Natividad, all of his losses have come by knockout, and he's been low volume. And then Tertios is just crazy volume. So I don't know. It's kind of a weird matchup. It's like the pieces don't quite fit in right, but it's kind of high upside for both guys.
Fair enough. All right, moving on down at 8,200 versus 8,000. We have Maria Oliveira versus Vanessa Demopoulos. Good fighters, bad fighters, good matchup, bad matchup for either.
They're both bad fighters. This is like a low level fight for sure. But they're both kind of interesting because they're opposite types of fighters. It's a striker versus grappler matchup. So like if the fight stays on the feet, Oliveira is gonna look amazing. And if the fight hits the ground, Oliveira is gonna look terrible and Demopoulos will look great. So it's a great matchup for both of them, I think, from that perspective. And they're both bad fighters.
Fair enough. Fernie Garcia against Brady Heastand. And we didn't talk about Heastand either, so let's talk about this matchup too. Two guys in their second UFC fights.
So that's actually really similar to the last one. I think these guys are both one dimensional. He stand as a wrestler, Garcia is a boxer. If the fight hits the mat, he stands going to have a huge advantage. If the fight stays standing, I think Garcia will have the boxing advantage. They're both so one dimensional that I think they're both bad fighters at this point. But I think it's a good matchup because they can both capitalize on the other's weakness. And I think it's a really good matchup for he stands specifically, just based on Garcia not really having any grappling, but being decent at standing back up.
Okay, and yeah, that's actually the perfect storm for an avalanche of takedowns. So if you're playing Prize Picks, hint hint, maybe a little over on he stands takedown number. All right, Jake, I think that does it for all the fighters with 4 fights or less in the UFC. Let's transition a little bit. Speaking of Prize Picks, you see the promo code there on screen. Use code OCCUPY when you sign up to get a deposit match bonus up to $100, 100 free bucks to make some more prop parlays. Cross sports, all kinds of sports that they offer. Really soft UFC lines. Jake, what stood out to you this week as a top Prize Picks play?
Yeah, I like the Della Maddalena under 6 minutes. I think Danny Roberts has just an incredibly terrible chin, and Jack D just puts everyone away early. So I think he's the real deal, man. I know he only has 2 fights so far. The guy knocked out what was that Russian guy's name?
Amiv.
Aziv or Amiv. Yeah, the guy that had just been like did decisions in every single fight, and then Jack D comes in, puts him away with a body shot. So I think this guy's striking's legit, man. And I think Danny Roberts' chin. He almost got finished by Trinaldo. Like, he almost gets finished by everyone.
All right. Under 6 minutes in the Jack Della Maddalena fight over on Prize Picks. Check out Jake's work at MMADFS.com and the Occupy Fantasy Daily Plug, which has more Prize Picks plays that you can add to that under 6 minutes in the Della Maddalena fight. All right. Speaking of fights to target, Jake, I think there's a couple obvious ones and a couple under the radar ones. We'll save the under the radar fight to target for the Daily Plug. But what's a pretty obvious fight that you think whoever wins likely scores pretty well in DFS?
Yeah, pretty much anytime Ian Kutalaba fights, you want to target his fights because the guy either gets a finish or gets finished in the first round or wins a decision and scores like 130 points. So I think you definitely want to target that fight. He's like 1-4-1 in his last 6 fights, just a terrible record. So that's the upside for Kennedy, and the upside on Kutalaba is if he does win, the guy just puts up huge scores every time. So I think that's definitely one you want to have exposure to both sides of.
Easy game. All right, let's close it out with our stream parlay of the week. For all the best bets, make sure you check out Jake's work at MMADFS.com. Sports betting on mobile apps is legal in Maryland next week, so I can't wait to take advantage of those, Jake, and check out your early bets on your site. Jake also puts his favorite bets that are remaining in the Friday Daily Plug, so I'm super pumped for it. Let's do a stream parlay. Speaking of the Heastan fight, Jake, I really like Heastan to win that decision based on his wrestling. I think you can get it at plus 165 or so, depending on where you're shopping. So I'll use that as my leg of the stream parlay.
Yeah, I think that's a good one, man. Garcia's never been finished, and Heastan has looked like a decision machine lately, so I like it. And then to pair up with that one, I'm gonna go Miles Johns over 1.5 rounds. To win, Johns to win and over 1.5 at plus 100. So if we pair those two up, it's going to be plus 430 on the parlay.
Plus 430. That's peanuts compared to our normal stream parlays, but we'll gladly take a win as we head into the holiday breaks here pretty shortly. So that'll do it for this video. We appreciate you sticking around and watching all of it. Again, MMADFS.com is where you can get the sheet from Jake, where he breaks down every fight from a betting and DFS perspective. Check out the archive, where you can get historical UFC DFS information, as important as ever, as it always is if you're playing GPPs, but now more so with the late swap news. And again, that's something we're going to follow. And knowing that we track everything, we're going to track as much as we can about late swap as well. So make sure you stay tuned for that. OccupyFantasy.com is where you can read the daily plug, top plays, lineup construction tips, best bets, prize picks plays, contest selection, everything you need to crush a UFC DFS card. Make sure you check that out today. The Occupy model ranks every fighter using our proprietary formula, FanDuel and DraftKings. And lineup builder. Build up 300 UFC DFS lineups, FanDuel and DraftKings with our custom rules. Excellent tool to crush those contests. That's it. Jake is on Twitter at DFS_MMA. I'm at Brian Jester FF for as long as Twitter is around. You can follow us at Occupy Fantasy. That'll do it. Appreciate you. As always, Spivac versus Derrick Lewis. Enjoy UFC Vegas 65. We are off next week for Thanksgiving, as is the UFC, obviously. But we'll be back the week after that and close out the last couple fights of the year. Thanks for listening.